Your example of looking back at your own work to find exactly what you're talking about in terms of questionable research practices is something that rings true with me. What I would like to talk about, and not because I look at your work, what I mean is I look at my work. What I would like to talk about, much like you, Kevin, is one specific aspect of questionable research practice, and that is overstatement of research and overstatement of findings. And so when I think about overstatement,
Yusuf, I only see a white slide.
I know, that's okay. That's okay. It's supposed to be, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
When I think specifically about overstatement of research, the question is, what is it? And it can be very often quite subtle. But I would like to draw your attention to one specific Duke researcher who I believe has very clearly in the past overstated their research in the media. And I'd like to show you a specific example of that. And so this is in the New York Times Well blog, where the researcher here was interviewed about a particular study. And the journalist asked, so the study was about the cost of cancer care and why patients sometimes have a difficulty in talking about the cost of their care to their patients. And so the journalist asked, what is the hesitancy in talking about the price of cancer treatment? And that researcher, being me, said patients link cost to quality and they fear blah, blah, blah. This is an overstatement. And it's an overstatement for this very reason, is that what I did here was take the findings from our study that had limitations and potential issues with how representative it was of the entire population of patients. And instead of saying that patients in our study link cost to quality, which was a valid finding in our study, I said patients generally link cost to quality. And I do believe that is an overstatement. And there are many forms of overstatement. This is just one of them, but they clearly have an impact, both short-term and long-term, on research, results, reporting, and potentially even clinical care. So let's talk about that for a minute. So the first question I'd like to ask is, how is clinical benefit often overstated within a clinical trial? So I'm a medical oncologist, and so let's focus specifically on a cancer trial. So this is the key finding within one particular trial. So this is a trial for a drug called everolimus, and it was randomized to everolimus versus placebo in pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor. What's most important here is this finding looking at overall survival, okay? So what they found was that in the relationship of everolimus versus placebo, the blue line is everolimus, the hazard ratio was 0.94. You can see the confidence interval here crosses 1, and the p-value, not surprisingly, is not significant. But if you look at where the blue line versus the yellow line cross that 50% threshold, the blue line crosses that threshold about 6 months later. Okay, so keep that in mind. So when you look at this paper's conclusions, this is what the authors write. So in conclusion, in the randomized controlled trial, everolimus demonstrated unprecedented median overall survival of 44 months in patients with this disease. So far, so good. They then go to say, although statistically not significant, the survival benefit of 6.3 months with everolimus is clinically meaningful. If there are any statisticians in the audience, I guarantee you they are not pleased. There was a lot of controversy after this article came out. There were some opinion articles published on how a statement like this could even be included in a manuscript. I mean, talk about overstatement. Basically what the authors, and it's my opinion, but basically what the authors are saying here is, we did the statistical analysis, but let's put that aside for a second and just focus on that 6-month improvement. And that is potentially misleading to those who might be reading these results. So how often do claims of meaningful clinical benefit fall short? And again, let's again focus within oncology clinical trials. So there have been consensus and expert and evidence-based clinical guidelines that have sort of set a standard for what is a meaningful clinical benefit within an oncology trial. So there was a study that looked at 49 oncology trials within I believe it was a 2-year period. And they looked for trials that specifically had this phrase, meaningful clinical benefit, in it. And what they found was that in this particular review, 71% of the time, that phrase, meaningful benefit, was used to describe a gain that didn't meet those consensus guidelines of what clinical meaningful benefit should actually be within an oncology clinical trial. So what we're seeing is that there is quite a bit of overstatement in our literature. So what? Why does that matter? Well, I believe there are both short-term and long-term implications of overstatement of results. So, the short-term implication is the potential impact on care that is specific to that trial result. So if you think about that pancreatic cancer trial, clinicians reading that might think, well, okay, I mean, sure, the statistics don't really make sense here, but it's 6 months, so that has to be clinically meaningful, right? So it could actually impact care in that subset of patients. The long-term implication is this insidious adoption of language, adoption of this language that's used where it is supposed to mean one thing, but is then used to mean something else. And as that becomes sort of adopted as the common parlance in scientific writing, that can be potentially dangerous as it becomes accepted in culture to use terms that don't necessarily reflect the results. But this question, I think, is most interesting to me is, why is there overstatement? And I think a couple of the speakers earlier this afternoon reflected on that, right? So, Dr. Pisetsky talked about impact and how impact factor is a driving force in academics today. And the desire to have impact is one of the reasons why. I think a second, Dr. Horner in her presentation mentioned, well, it's okay for scientists to be wrong. I would take that a step further and I would say it's okay to not have an earth-shattering result. And sometimes this need to have a headline might drive overstatement in science. And the third is actually, I think, the most concerning, is that it might be easier. So you think about, my quote from that article from many years ago, where I said, well, patients feel blah, 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 as opposed to saying, well, in our relatively limited study of just 300 patients, that might not be representative of the entire, national population of patients. We found that in our study, patients found blah, blah, blah. Right? It's more clunky to make that statement, but it is clearly more accurate. So I would say that as we publish, as we write up our results, it's important for labs and research programs to think about overstatement explicitly, to address it well before the stage of presentation and publication. And it should be a part of mentoring as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zafar.